I've been doing this whole solo thing for 2 years now. Well, okay, I say solo, but I still have my two great friends who help me with the stuff when I need it. But I've been making these scripted video essays for a while now. And the whole reason I started was all because of this game that I had maybe played for a few hours and immediately decided to go on the internet and bash it.
Even the greatest have humble beginnings.
But isn't that weird? I essentially started a new chapter of my life by disliking a game that I only had a mild interest in to begin with. And it was on sale. I made the video, and looking back, I think that I was just trying stuff out at the core. I was trying to see if I could actually write stuff, combine different kinds of footage and music, and make complex edits for my skills at the time. And when I go back and watch the first video, I still agree with some of the things that I said, but I also notice how pointless some of my observations are. But once again, it's obvious that I just wanted to test out the process and possibility of making a video like that. But I think I inadvertently created my own predetermined bias against Neo by immortalizing my opinions on the internet. I put my brain in a bit of an echo chamber by only listening to my own negative opinions. I just saw Neo as a disappointing game because it wasn't Dark Souls 3, which is totally unfair for some very obvious reasons. And I haven't revisited the game in quite some time, but seeing as how it's been a little over 2 years since the making of that first video, and I've negatively mentioned it quite a bit since then, I wonder if I'm still living in that biased, underinformed opinion. I only played for a few hours into the first time around, so I don't think I gave it a fair shake. So, as this year's season finale, I think it'd be cool to take a real look at the game that started it all. This is Neo vs. Soulsborne, Round 2. I just mentioned that I kind of skimmed over a lot of stuff that's actually really important about Neo. But back in the early videos, I kind of had a bad problem about not taking the time to crack open the shell and get into the meat of the issues I have with the games. Hence why the videos were so short. These days I like dissecting the issues and digging deep. I have a different, more thorough mindset. So I suppose I can use that to start with. I've made myself a bit of a catalog in these 2 years. Since I've been playing games with the intent to enjoy and review, I pick up and notice stuff more easily. And I've also played this game's distant relative, and I've seen other companies' attempts at Souls-style games, and combat systems are usually what interest me the most in games. So let's see what I had to say when I first looked at it. The stance system gives you more options and attacks with a single weapon than previously seen in this style of combat. Not to mention the added mobility makes for a much more agile and deadly player character. Okay, do you see what I mean? I think I still agree with this for the most part. Neo's combat system centers around a 3-stance melee system. Ninja magic and tools, special moves, and some stealth. You have a low, mid, and high stance, which all have different attacks with different attack speeds, hitbox areas, and key consumption recharge speeds. For example, your low attacks are quicker and more consecutive while using less ki, but don't do as much damage to the enemy's respective health or ki. Mid stance is good for average damage and ki consumption, and high stance is the high damage but costly option at the other side of the spectrum. Essentially, the different levels of stance reflect the values for attack speed and ki consumption. If enough damage is done to the enemy's ki, they can be toppled over and are opened up for massive damage via a critical hit. It makes for a pretty interesting risk versus reward system. You also have mechanics similar to the weight and posture systems that From Software established all the way back in Demon Souls. And here's the funny thing. I actually think they're better implemented here if I'm being completely honest. In Dark Souls, the riskier moves don't really offer much reward if you're not 100% sure that you'll be safe afterwards. See, a risk is most meaningful when there's a chance at either success or failure, a net gain or a net loss. In that sense, taking a chance on a risky attack can feel like a bit of a gamble. In other words, if you get too comfortable with more dangerous maneuvers, you can still be punished for it. Compare this with Neo, and the game almost feels built around the idea of aggressive play. and knowing when to take risks. The first boss at the end of the coastal village is a good example of this. Playing it safe can only take you so far before the fight escalates past the point of even trade. You either start making smarter, riskier decisions, or you hope that you're better equipped for a war of attrition. Spoiler alert, you're probably not. So on the basics, it's a +1 for Nioh. Outside the basics of combat, acknowledging that the game borrows pretty substantially from Dark Souls' formula, what does Nioh do differently to set it apart from the other so-called Souls-like titles? Well, in a word, more. Whether or not you'd care to admit it, Dark Souls combat isn't anything spectacular. It's not super complex and the game's systems don't give you a lot of options, at least not in a sandboxy kind of way. In this regard, Dark Souls is brilliant, as it allows the devs to balance the game extremely tightly. Nioh, on the other hand, combines the fast combos, ninja magic, and the multiple weapon choices of, say, Ninja Gaiden with what might be my favorite game mechanic ever, a system not too different from the posture meter in Sekiro. By sprinkling in these two stellar ingredients, Nioh manages to create something kind of intriguing, a mix of old ideas and new ideas. Having the combat operate with a heavier focus on action, while also incentivizing resource management in the form of both player and enemy key bars, means that the pace of any given battle falls more into the hands of the player as opposed to the enemy. Let me explain. In Dark Souls 1, and to a lesser extent 3, combat slowly began to feel like you were always waiting for the enemy to make the first move, either evading attacks for a backstab crit or parrying an attack for the riposte crit. Nioh, on the other hand, wants you to keep the attack up, not only to whittle down health, but key, opening up the enemy for critical damage. Sekiro also adopted a system like this years later, however, and I feel Nioh deserves some credit for striking the first chip away from this untapped gold mine. Nioh's critical damage works as a temporary buff, or a nerf to the enemy as opposed to a one-hit kill or a full health bar sweep. So you could argue that the benefit isn't as substantial as in Sekiro, but it still feels so great to master your moveset and the swapping of your stances, and mastering the art of keeping your ki high while whittling down your opponents. On the combat mechanics, another +1 to Nioh. One area that seems to get overlooked when talking about this style of game is the number of options for the player when starting their journey, i.e. the starting classes in your Soulsborne titles. In Nioh, you have a choice from a rather large list of weapons and other attributes that will ultimately be important later on in the playthrough. I mean, while we're being honest here, these games typically allow for any class to be viable at the very beginning of a run, even if one is clearly the best starting option. In my first playthrough, I chose a sword because I'm basic, and a Kusarigama because it looked cool. What the game doesn't make clear from the onset is how important these weapon choices are for what kind of build you're wanting to dedicate yourself to. In the Souls title, a basic sword and board build can easily be molded into a powerful sorcerer or a pyromancer given the proper time and attention. Does Nioh offer the same kind of flexibility in its progression? My first set of weapons were alright, but playing through even the earlier areas, I often felt like it was a bit too weak for some of the encounters. Thus, I became frustrated and quit before I got too deep into the game. I know, a rage quit. Feel free to share your most creative insult in the comment section below. And suplex that subscribe button. Peace! But for real, this time I had a much clearer idea of what I wanted from my character. I know how I play these games, and what areas always leave me the most wanting. I chose a spear for some range and quick strikes, and I chose an axe for the heavy health damage as well as some substantial ki damage. And guys, this is how everyone should play the game if you're just starting out. I know, hot take, but you need to be able to wade in the waters that is Nioh's combat, like I did, and then come back with a setup you like better. This should be treated as the strength build, i.e. everyone's first Souls build. I think that it was also a big plus because I understood more about how the game works now. I paid more attention to the combat and how to handle enemies much more effectively. I had maybe 3 or 4 strategies that I would try cycle in and out when I would come across enemies. I would start out with a heavy attack from my axe to break down their ki, if not outright killing them. And depending on the size and aggressiveness of the enemy, I would decide which of my tools I should rely on. Now, a lesser man would simply show you gameplay footage and breeze over these points. But me? Ha! I'm gonna make a chart. If it's a weak human small fry, I would just bully him with my axe's high stance. If it's a dangerous large demon, I would keep my distance with my spear's mid stance. It was a really fun dance of trying to figure out what battle tactics would have to fit with that enemy. With all these different moves that feel so good to pull off, almost every small enemy encounter was fun to figure out. Even if the enemies themselves weren't too varied, they were always dangerous. And as I said in the previous video, the enemies' formations they throw at you just aren't all that interesting. It's almost never anything clever. If you were to give away $1 every time you stumble upon a moderately sized area with a melee enemy and then an archer up on a high rise behind you, you'd have to get a second job, or a Patreon. And if it's not something uninspired like that, it's just a barrage of large enemies that have absurd amounts of health and ki. And therein comes a flaw I've noticed with the game. Game got cheaps! The designers do this super cute thing where they like bottleneck you down hallways, and then they have these things at the very end to just like get a cheap kill out of you. It's very unfortunate that the designers don't have more interesting layouts than these on display here. This kind of enemy isn't unheard of, but even From Software realized that it offered an inherent problem to the core design. If enemies are thrown in simply as a means to kill the player, not to challenge them, they probably shouldn't be there, right? However, if we're talking cheap, and I mean cheap, the crown has got to go to these spiders. These little bastards, which aren't difficult to kill, mind you, are always hidden up on the ceiling, but there's no indication that they're lurking above. If you walk under one of these spiders, they drop down on you and take you out instantly, unless you have an absurd amount of health. You know what area I've never ever been trained to watch my entire life of playing games like this? Just take a guess. The ceiling. The only way to get past them is to know their position after you've already been attacked. Slowly walk around blocking the whole time, or constantly look up every few steps to make sure you won't be killed instantly. These were probably the devs' idea of a non-traditional threat or a throwaway enemy to make the area more atmospheric or unique, but it just comes across as lazier than more humanoid somehow. It's not a challenge to move slowly in a game, it's just a waste of time. Attention every game developer. If you're listening, the only acceptable time to make the player go slow is in a horror game. So if your name isn't Capcom and you're not developing the Resident Evil 3 remake, please take out the go slow or get insta-killed enemy. We beg you. You get lucky on some occasions and stumble across instances where a little bit of thought was put into where and how these enemies were placed. But is that what we want to hear about a level's design? That you're lucky to actually have a fair shot at not dying. It would be different if the game lets you take advantage of these movesets that are a good fit in these areas, but it always shuts down your creativity whenever you think you have a good idea. Good thing most of the enemy AI is pretty exploitable. I know that's not actually a plus, but just like in Dark Souls, if an enemy likes to just let me kill them instantly after this force, I will take it. It does not happen all that frequently, but it does happen on occasion. I think the bosses have it a bit better, even if I'd say that selectively. Back on my point earlier, most Dark Souls bosses don't react to your larger hits beyond the invisible damage thresholds some fights come with. You could do a big hit on a boss, but unless it drags their health bar below that predetermined point, you should go ahead and plan on trading hits. I really like how in the games like Ninja Gaiden, if you know the boss's patterns and know how to take them down, the battle can be over very quickly. Nioh keeps this tradition. Just like the regular enemies, bosses have a ki meter. Every move they use burns ki, and every attack you land burns their ki as well. So when you work down their ki, you can leave them open for some big damage. The smaller humanoid bosses you fight are by far my favorite. They never feel cheap or overpowered. You just have to play really well and use your counter opportunities wisely. But the same does not go for the larger monster bosses. Not all of them are bad. At their best, they're actually a lot of fun to fight and find their workarounds. But at their worst, they're camera-hogging tanks with frustrating damage outputs and infuriating attacks that come out way too fast and have a laughable tracking radius. To take them down when they're at their worst, it's a war of attrition at its most frustrating. The absolute best example of this is the big blob boss that just has to be the most deliberately frustrating enemy I've ever encountered in a game. For the first half of the fight, it doesn't join you in the arena. He stays at a good enough distance so it's possible for you to fall in the water when attacking it. Oh yeah, water. Water's a bad idea. Meanwhile, there are plenty of other opportunities to be killed in one hit. Besides the holes in the arena and every attack he has in the second phase, he also has a huge laser that can come out almost instantly and can sometimes kill you just as you enter the arena if RNGesus is smiling on you that day. Now, this boss is frustrating no matter what and is nothing but a test of patience and endurance. But the most infuriating piece of this puzzle is also the most cryptic. For you see, there is no way to tell what this stupid boss is weak to unless you have some prior video game knowledge hidden in your back pocket. In the Big Blob Thing stage, there are fire amulets that give your weapon fire damage for a short time. So you have to just assume that they would be stocking you up for the boss in the stage itself. And to further this point, these fire masks you find in the stage absolutely destroy the thing. The stage itself is pretty good, it's just immediately soured by a terrible boss. And I'm sure we've all had to do this at some point. Use your weapon with the longest reach and poke the boss to death. Or at least enough to get them down to a comfortable amount of health for your guardian form to safely finish them off. I typically handled a boss killing me pretty well. I mean, it's just a game. I can usually keep my cool and understand that I lost the fight. But this is where my biggest frustrations with Nioh come into play. These bosses don't test anything except how long you can safely land pathetic attacks and dodge their one-hit kill moves. So when you're doing so well in a fight and you decide to experiment and maybe try one of your special moves to maybe get some big damage, just to be severely punished by an instant death, it's a little demoralizing. When the game does such a good job of giving you interesting moves that work the way they're supposed to pretty much everywhere else, the few moments where it fumbles and doesn't adhere to its own rules just pulls you out that much faster. It's just one of those things that makes you say, why? And some of the special moves that you get are so fun and effective. The axe spin was very risky, but could come in handy for big damage if you were so inclined, but did get me in trouble if I was too indulgent. The spear had a move that made you swap places with an enemy, and there was even a move that just shoved enemies. I actually couldn't find a use for it until I came across this beefy optional boss on this bridge, then shplop, instant favorite move. After these 2 years, I feel that the specific encounters might have shown some cracks in the armor, and the concepts of fair and balance in games like this have been ironed out more with the release of subsequent games. Sekiro and Fallen Order most recently have demonstrated that challenge can be completely removed from the realm of cheap or tedious, and the game can still be lauded for its engaging combat and deep mechanics. In this way, Nioh feels more antiquated and difficult to go back to. That's a -1 for Nioh. Alright, now, the loot system. So when you defeat enemies of all shapes and sizes, they will drop items, equipment, money, and Amrita, which are the experience points of this game. Every single item follows your typical color-coded rarity chart. It goes from uncommon to rare to exotic to divine, but kind of only sometimes. See, this kind of system is something that requires a deep consideration of your loadout. What armor properties work best with certain weapons, but then you can fuse different equipment to raise their levels, but you might lose some of the important passive abilities, among other very crucial details. Once you have all this figured out, it's time to go into the mission, where you will accumulate just as much, if not more, useless crap, with more numbers and percentages you have to compare and make judgments on which one works best with all your current equipment. Then once you've decided your ideal setup, you should probably dispose of all that useless stuff you don't want anymore so it doesn't clutter up your already confusing menus.
this shit.
Great! Now that's taken care of, we can hop into the next mission and do it all again when we're done. I know loot games are a different kind of game altogether, but when did it become to paint by numbers? Get it? Cause it has colors with the numbers, you know. If the acquisition of loot becomes something so granular that you get completely sucked out of the experience and thrown into a numbers game of what different values and passives, then we should work towards making loot more intuitive, period. Do you see what I'm getting at here? In every other action game I've played, even the first Dark Souls, you get attached to your equipment. If you start doing well with a certain weapon or spell, you want to keep it and continue to do better with it. But since here the weapons are randomly generated, you find stuff better than your current stuff literally in every new level. Yes, you can upgrade your weapons and try to boost the damage of your favorites, but that means navigating the confusing and horrible menus that don't do anything for explaining how the weapon enhancements actually work. Again, look at the Souls games. I want this one to be better, so I have to find this thing and put them together. Players are stupid and dumb. You gotta give us pictures like in a book. No one wants to read a Bible passage to add earth to their big axe. We already talked about Genesis. It feels so much better to me when I work towards a hard to obtain thing in a game and then finally get it. But it's almost the exact opposite feeling when I throw away the best weapon I've seen thus far after only an hour of using it. And it's a very similar situation with the items placed around the game world. Since everything compares to the Souls series, think the shinies scattered throughout Lordran. I actually think I covered this pretty well in the first video. In Dark Souls, when you see an item, it's exciting. There's so much suspense and anticipation to see what unique, useful tool you'll be adding to your inventory now. But in Nioh, it feels like you're picking up soda cans off the side of the road so you can recycle them to make $1 or $2. It's a lot of work for something that doesn't feel very rewarding. Games of all genres have long since figured out how to make getting a new toy or items fun. If it's not something that doesn't have a cool name that makes your mouth water, it builds suspense with a small cinematic that tells you, dude, this is gonna be sick. And I gave Sekiro, my pick for Game of the Year, the same exact criticism. You can't just constantly dangle the same shiny item in front of the player and then be surprised when they get tired of being handed the same recycled, randomly generated crap over and over again. Look at, again, Jedi Fallen Order. When you find stuff around the world, it always has utility. The lack of usable items, like the broken pottery stones from Sekiro, does mean that there are less shinies in the game world, but I'll take each item being a new cosmetic or health upgrade just to avoid 18 stacks of stuff I have no desire to ever use, or God forbid, the permanent version of that same item, Sekiro. Man, what was I talking about again? This kind of stuff is so lame, and I think that's honestly a perfect analysis for Nioh and its place in this genre. The thrills of combat and the depth of its mechanics is always kinda grinded to a halt when the clunky and meandering loot system or the monotony of the game pickups rears its ugly head in. Not to mention the game always seems to outstay its welcome, not only in the length of the missions themselves, but also in how long it will take you to see the end credits. Reusing bosses and an obvious lack of creative juice in the tank makes it so obvious when this game begins to lose its steam a little over halfway through the adventure. I appreciate so much more about this game coming back to it after all this time, but the same issues I had back then also came into greater focus, meaning that while my opinion is certainly softened on the game, it's still far from the game it could be. Here's hoping for the sequel. But what do you fellow kids think? Am I wrong in my criticisms of Nioh? Sometimes this kind of thing just comes down to what you like and what you don't. I'd love to know what you think. Does it compare well with newer contemporaries in this genre? Is this your favorite of the new numerous Souls-like games? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thank you so very much for stopping by and sticking it out with us this season. Have a great day and a great new year. We'll see you in 2020.